Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lucy Bernholz. I am the director of Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab, and it's my honor to have been asked to organize this conversation. And we've got four extraordinary people here to join us, and all of you, because I really would like this to become more workshop-y than lecture-y. We'd asked for a different room setup, but this is what we got. So what I wanted to do was actually set up the problem as I see it, the opportunity that's out there, and then I'll introduce quickly the four speakers, but then engage all of us in thinking about what actually is the problem or problems that we're trying to solve for. What do we already have underway as strategies, experiments, institutional innovations to address those problems? And what questions do we have that researchers affiliated with HAI or other universities might be able to contribute to? So there's sort of three parts to the 2 hours we have together. And I will say a couple of sentences about the way I see where we are. Each of our panelists will speak for 5 or so minutes about their work and what they're doing and how they see the problem and the potential opportunity. And then we'll invite you to both ask some questions about anything you've heard from any of us, offer up the strategies or experiments that you're involved in as we try to actually get a handle on all of the different kinds of activities that are underway, and then see if we can't collectively move toward those second two goals of the time, which is what do these different experiments in structure have in common, and what are the researchable opportunities? So with that background, let me just tell you, the Digital Civil Society Lab, I started here at Stanford in 2014 with Rob Reich, and it's motivated by a pretty big fear, to be honest, and that fear can be summed up as this. In a time when each of us individually is dependent on digital devices and global networks that are either corporate created and or government surveilled, is there actually anything even remotely resembling an independent civic space in the digital world? And our sense of that is actually that there isn't. That there really isn't this critical, important space that both history and theory tell us are important for democracies to stand, a place where people can get together of their own volition and take some kind of collective action. And in a digitally mediated world, again, where the machinery is primarily commercially provided and government surveilled, that the space doesn't exist. So the challenge then for the Digital Civil Society Lab became, well, how do we recreate some kind of independent space, recognizing it won't look anything like what we might have assumed existed in the past, and this is not a homage to some nostalgic sense of the past, that what needs to be created in an age when we're all digitally dependent is some new form of that independent civic space. So there we have four hypotheses, and this conversation fits squarely into one of them. So the four hypotheses overall are that we actually need to simultaneously make progress on creating alternative technologies, on creating new kinds of organizations, on creating new laws, and on changing our own social norms about how we interact with digital technologies and global networks. So those are the four areas of change, if you will. There's a domain of change. And this conversation, which was cheekily called Artificially Intelligent Associations, because come on, how could you pass up that name? That's just a great name. Is squarely in the bucket of thinking about the organizational forms that we need to create, that we may need to create, that we're tweaking or modifying already, to actually manage and govern and hold and possibly destroy digital data, algorithms, insights in behalf of some kind of public benefit. Okay? So if you think about in the American context, 140 years ago now, the not-for-profit organization which most of us in the US are fairly familiar with, as a corporate form codified in law with a couple of distinct characteristics that distinguish it from a commercial corporation, was created to manage the contribution of private financial resources for public benefit, right? That's what nonprofits do at the most mechanistic, instrumental level I could possibly describe them. And in order for that to work, there's a set of actual legal structures around them. There's a set of corporate requirements within them. And then there's a normative understanding of them. And the challenge I think we face collectively now, when the resource is digital data or digitized algorithms or the insights that derive from them, is to figure out what's the mechanism that we're going to use to move forward. Because to simply assume that a not-for-profit corporation that was designed to do that with financial resources can just automatically serve that purpose for digital resources is not going to work. We're seeing it all over the place. It doesn't work now. It's not going to work. We need some form of alteration. Perhaps it's a mere tweak. Perhaps it's a simple change to the corporate code that governs nonprofits, or perhaps it's an entirely different kind of institution. And I use that very loosely. When I'm thinking of institution, I am not necessarily thinking of the building we just left or the campus we're meeting on. It might look very, very different than that. But that's what we've built to date, and we're building other things now. So that's the arc of the conversation. I should say that that is only half of, from the lab's perspective, that's only half of the questions we have about the intersections between artificial intelligence, data, global networks, and associational forms. And I'm happy to talk a lot about the other half of those questions, but for the purpose of this conversation, we wanted to focus it on what kind of institutions are we and will we be creating to serve this purpose in our democracies in the digital age. So the four speakers we have, I'll introduce them very briefly, bring a variety of perspectives to this, and they're each going to talk about both what it is they're doing that fits into this conversation, what the challenges are that they're facing, how they think about what form they're adopting or tweaking, and then together we'll try to identify some of those common elements in some of the research questions. So starting at my right here, Eileen Donahoe is the director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator and a globally recognized human rights expert. The Global Digital Policy Incubator is a sister institution here on the Stanford campus to the Digital Civil Society Lab, and I'm always delighted to get a chance to work with Eileen. To Eileen's right is Sean McDonald, who is the leader of an organization called digitalpublic.io and a widely published thinker on the governance of data and data supply chains. To Sean's right is Jasmine McNealy, a professor at the University of Florida, a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center, and a fellow also of the Digital Civil Society Lab, as is Sean, I should say that. And then at the far end of the table, Terah Lyons is the executive director of the Partnership for AI, which is a San Francisco-based global multi-stakeholder partnership working on artificial intelligence. So I'm going to ask Eileen to kick us off with some framing about this question of associational form, artificial intelligence, civil society, and human rights. Eileen?
Great. So first off, I'm going to try to talk not too fast because there's a lot to be said on this incredibly rich topic, which is why I apologize for bringing slides, but I think it will help. First off, the institutional form I work with is the existing international human rights framework, which I see as simultaneously out of sync with certain aspects of the digital global realm, as well as very well suited to it. I want to say that in the human rights space, a lot of work has already been done by people focused on freedom of expression, privacy, emerging work on democratic participation, the right to democratic participation with the disinformation threat. Very little has been done. She is on the cutting edge of defining what it looks like to protect independent civic space in a digital world. So I think that's important context. I'm going to start by talking about what's out of sync. Okay. What's out of sync and then what fits. So this first slide it's a little complicated, but I sort of see 4 features of the globalized, digitized space that make it inherently challenging to work with the international human rights framework. The first of which is the basic transborder mode of the internet's operation is disruptive on its face to an international order based on the concept of nation states. Sovereign nation states with the obligation to protect citizens' rights defined by territorial boundaries. Instantaneous extraterritorial reach is the default rather than the exception. Governments have the primary obligation to keep citizens safe and to protect their liberty. They are really struggling with how to do this in our transborder global realm. So that's the first thing. The second thing I will mention is digitization itself. Digitization of everything, IoT, digitization of society. Again, on the security side, digitization has created all kinds of systemic, society-wide vulnerabilities. Governments don't know what to do about, and we're really flat-footed in that regard. But also on the liberty front, digitization have tremendous implications for, obviously, privacy, which in turn has gigantic consequences for liberty. The simple idea being if everything you say and do is tracked and monitored, it will squelch where you feel free to go, what you say, who you meet with, and that goes to the heart of can we have independent civic space? And I will also just say it turns out privacy is so much more important to democratic society and the enjoyment of human rights than private sector tech companies have recognized. And that's kind of, I think some are catching on. I think there's some new potential there, new business models based on privacy, trust, and all that, but we'll see. Third big disruptive feature is this trend toward privatization of governance. You all have heard this idea of private sector platforms functioning as quasi-sovereigns. On the security side, they play a much bigger role in protecting people's data and housing it. They own, operate, and secure the critical civilian internet infrastructure. So they're playing an outsized role compared to what was envisioned in the original human rights framework. On the freedom side of the equation, these mega digital platforms also have a gigantic role as quasi-sovereigns, dictating the parameters of freedom of expression through algorithms, terms of service, community guidelines, et cetera. As well, I will note, governments are increasingly turning to the private sector to take over judicial function. They are outsourcing the responsibility for assessing criminality, and they are even overreaching beyond that. They're basically outsourcing censorship by asking companies to do what democratic governments themselves could not do. So that's an interesting trend. And then the fourth feature that is obviously relevant to algorithmically driven societies is the basic move toward governance by machine, where machine decisions are being relied upon in many realms of our lives, that impact citizens' rights, education, health, policing, sentencing, parole, all kinds of things. But governance actors in the public sector often lack an understanding of the basis of those algorithmic decisions, and they lack any ability to scrutinize them. So that means loss of transparency and a basic loss of democratic accountability and any prospect for remedy, which are essential elements of the human rights framework. Okay. That's the out of sync part. I don't say that in every audience, but I do in an audience concerned about protecting civic space, because I don't want to undermine the international human rights framework, which I think is very important for geopolitical reasons. So what are the features of the existing framework that are peculiarly well suited to governance in the digital realm? And I want to highlight 4 things as well. The first of which is the starting premise of the inherent dignity of the human person and the centrality of the human person in governance. I think that is a really essential first step to human-centered governance. Oh, sorry, I brought the wrong one. Well, let me look up here. I brought the wrong slide. Oh, well. Second feature, let me see if I can pull this up by, well, one is global legitimacy. I don't have the slide here. Another feature is the global legitimacy that has been established through multilateral and multi-stakeholder negotiation. It happened in a context of the crisis of World War II. The human rights framework's been embedded into national constitutions, legislation around the world. It is like a shared lingua franca. It's a shared global language. And I personally think it's going to be almost impossible to replicate that level of recognition in any new framework. And I think we give that up at our own peril. So I think that's really important. But there are a variety of features, global legitimacy, negotiation, human person at the center. Oh, broad spectrum of both procedural and substantive rights that speak directly to many of the existing concerns that people have about the AI implications on society. Right to privacy speaks to digitization of everything, mass surveillance. Freedom of expression speaks to algorithmic curation of information and how it affects what we see. The rights to equal protection and non-discrimination goes right to the heart of, bias and discrimination being embedded into data. And then also the, scrutability challenges related to fair process, democratic accountability, the rule of law, and the right to remedy. Those are concepts all embedded, and so I think that's a really substantial starting place for analysis, and the combination of being globally recognized and having that framework is really important. The last feature is that the existing framework speaks well, not just to the normative principles, but to the governance framework. So the rights in here in the human person, the governments have the primary obligation to protect the rights in society, both on the liberty and security side. And in a relatively new development in the human rights framework, private sector has the responsibility to respect human rights, to do due diligence processes to make sure that the effects of their products and services is not harmful to human rights, and then if they find those harms, to remedy them. That's the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And that combination of obligations, responsibilities, does a lot of work for us. Much more, I would say, than all these new ethical principles, which are great, and they bring AI-specific insights, but they don't really necessarily spell out roles and responsibilities. The last thing, I could say so much more about governance innovation that has already happened. I'm going to make a simple point here. The disruption of society that has happened in, the fourth industrial revolution, software eating the world, the whole thing, has actually brought some interesting governance innovation pre-AI, or pre-thinking about AI, I'll put it that way. With the, in the original global internet governance space, there was this move to global multi-stakeholder governance because there was a recognition that the technology community was essential and that governments would be clueless. And the basic idea there was to create an open, interoperable internet. And it was really largely about the technical standards and the software protocols, but it was about governance of the internet at the hardware layers, at the architecture layer. Then with sort of the rise of social media and the information realm, we went to governance on the internet, where there was a recognition that we needed to be governing what happens on the internet. And I will mention at the UN Human Rights Council 2012, June 1st, UN resolution on internet freedom, simply laying down this idea that human rights have to be protected online as offline. And that was a really simple but big move and kind of foundational to this whole idea. With digitization and everything, we've moved into sort of thinking about how to protect privacy, data regulation, but it's obviously so much more needs to be done there. It's so foundational, but at least people have their heads around it. And I would say the simple idea I have here is that we need the same move in the AI realm as we had in the global internet governance realm, which is simply human rights have to be applied and protected and used as a basis of analysis of AI-driven societies. It's the same thing. And that's kind of my bottom line. Last thing I will quickly mention, and we can talk about these later, these are just some little smattering of places where I see leadership in this space. So on the government side, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner is doing some of the best cutting-edge analysis of how to bring a human rights lens to government procurement and government reliance on AI. The World Economic Forum and the Business and Social Responsibility did a really good white paper on responsible use of technology that brings together all of the new insights from these ethical principles that have popped up, like something like 260 different sets of principles, and tries to marry it and merge it with the human rights frame. And I think that's a really constructive approach. OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, is doing the BTEC initiative, and the idea is to elaborate more extensively on how to make the existing UN guiding principles on business and human rights more relevant and speak more directly to the AI realm. And then several private sector companies are leading as well in terms of bringing a human rights lens to what they do. And here I'd say the move toward human rights impact assessments by the private sector in the AI realm is really important. That's all.
Thank you, Eileen.
So I'm interested in studying failure, or actually failures of government, failures of civil society organizations, failures of these institutions or systems through which we as people in society are supposed to function, failures of the contracts we have between government, between the civil society organizations and the people they're supposed to be serving. And so when I think about human rights and particularly the failure of human rights with respect to technology and governance of data, I think of failure. Because, for one thing, since 1945 in the Charter, and then 48 in the Declaration, I think about what had to advance for us to even think about human rights that would be in any way inclusive of all of us even sitting in this room. I also think about lack of enforcement. I think of selectivity of enforcement. I think of how we define human and humanity and who that excludes or who that has traditionally excluded or ignored or neglected. And I think of the lack of sovereignty that certain communities have over their data, over who's using data about them or them in the data. And so when I think about the forms that I'm interested in, I'm looking at what I'm calling community as technology. And that is, if we define technology as the use of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, and there are communities who have said, we have historically faced these failures of government, failures of civil society, failures of these societal institutions, so we are going to form mutual aid societies, so to speak. We are going to form grassroots organizations or just people themselves who have committed themselves to being infrastructure. So we think of people as infrastructure. Simone's a good reading for any students who care. So we think of people as infrastructure. So a couple of examples of that is Detroit. Detroit historically has been panned as a failed democratic enclave full of black people, full of poor people, full of ghetto people, full of whatever you want to call it. But if we're being honest, Detroit has been neglected, right? And the people have been forgotten, but people haven't forgotten themselves. And so there is a lot of technological innovation coming out of Detroit from these community members, teaching each other how to use their technology safely, teaching each other about the technologies that are being deployed on them, and teaching each other the skills and sharing the experiences that they need to help each other out. One form of this is the DAC, or the Decentralized Autonomous Community. So people are forming these communities, they're planning them out, and see what can be done with blockchain. Can we create a token that we can share, that we could trade, that we can use for ourselves in spite of all the crap that is deployed on us, right? Another kind of mutual aid, mutual assistance, mutual obligation kind of form or function, I'm thinking of Los Angeles. There's various communities in Los Angeles, various organizations. I'm thinking specifically of Stop LAPD Spying, for example, which has been very, very instrumental in going after police and government and corporate use of these spy or emergent technologies that are basically performing the function of spying on citizens and non-citizens as well. I also think of Oakland. We can see in the past year the outcomes of a concerted campaign to get the government in Oakland to ban facial recognition technology. So we have these mutual aid, mutual assistance organizations that are existing, that are emerging, that are sustaining themselves with regard to what are we going to do with technology? How are we going to govern ourselves? How do we get to a place to attempt to remedy the continued failures of these massive institutions we have in society? Now, what needs to happen, though, is with every movement for liberation, with every movement for change, there has to be law, there has to be regulation to accompany it, and that regulation, that law has to be enforced. That's just bottom line, right? So I have, under the First Amendment of the United States, I have the right to freedom of speech, supposedly, right? But that has to be enforced, and sometimes it has to be enforced by me suing a member of government or a government institution. But there has to be some kind of enforcement to make sure that my rights, my privileges are, respected. For this space that we're in, there has to be comprehensive legislation, and not just legislation aimed at technology. It has to be legislation aimed at fulfilling those disparities that we've had in this society for such a long time that we know we need to fix. Gender equity, equality, also privacy and data governance, comprehensive legislation. But we have those things that our tech is just amplifying, and so legislation is necessary. But I'm heartened because people always fill in the gap where there is failure. But people shouldn't have to, and people cannot be the infrastructure by which all failure is remedied. They are remedies, we are remedies, but we can't remedy the entire sickness. And so that's what I study.
Fantastic, thank you. Terah Lyons from the Partnership on AI is going to talk next.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this, Lucy. And I'm excited that you're all in the room with us today. I'm going to talk for most of my time about the partnership itself. It's a really interesting sort of case study in institutional models associated with what we are talking about today. So I'm going to do as much a deep dive in 5 minutes as I can, and I'm happy to answer more questions later. So we are, as Lucy briefly mentioned previously, we are a global multi-stakeholder organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based here-ish in San Francisco, but work with 100 organizations globally, ranging from industries to civil society and advocacy organizations and academic institutions. And we were originally founded by a group of senior AI research scientists at some of the largest technology companies working in the AI space right now. They included Amazon, Apple, Facebook, IBM, Google, and Microsoft. And as founding members of our board, which is constructed in a really interesting way, we also had them joined by 6 nonprofit organizations or institutional representatives. So the ACLU sits on our board alongside those 6 companies, the MacArthur Foundation, Policy Link, which is an Oakland-based racial equity organization, and several other academic representatives. And the nature of the organization is such that our goals are really to attempt to bridge theory and practice in developing a body of evidence that is meant to inform the responsible development and deployment of AI technologies. And the audience for that work is principally those institutions that hold the greatest power in achieving impact at scale right now, which are AI developers, essentially. So commercial technology companies and industrial research laboratories that are, by and large, investing the most in developing these technologies and having the biggest impact right now on the ecosystem. So we're really focused at the practice level and really hoping to try to generate the type of research and best practices upon which organizations like technology companies and others really can start to shift their behavior in meaningful ways, and also eventually to inform a body of smart policymaking, regulation, and law that is meant to support the long-term accountability structures that are necessary in order to really have effective technology governance. So that's sort of the high-level overview. We do that in a variety of different ways. We have a research organization. I should also mention that we're a wholly independent entity. So, excuse me, sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. We function completely independently from the founding companies that I mentioned. So even though they are represented on our board, we have several governance mechanisms in place such that our decision-making as an institution is air-gapped from their influence. So we've thought pretty carefully about that, and I'm happy to talk more about that later as well. And we make decisions essentially as a staff and secretariat working with the 100 institutions that are in our network. And the research that we conduct is really, in many ways speaks truth to power to the organizations that founded us in an attempt to positively influence their behavior. So a couple of notes about opportunities and challenges, because I think that is an important set of topics to sort of foray into. One of the big focus areas of us right now is in what we call capacity building. And essentially, it is the idea that you, as a multi-stakeholder organization, and there have been many of them in the history of technology governance, not so many of them in the history of AI, so I think we are probably the first, as we were founded in 2016, and almost everything we're doing is very experimental. But one of the lessons that we've learned from our predecessors and other very wise people working in the space is that you cannot call civil society organizations to the table to participate in work of the sort that we are facilitating without meaningfully facilitating and resourcing their participation. So it seems a very basic point when presented that way, but it's really, really crucial ingredient to effective, inclusive, multi-stakeholder deliberations. So we do that by both providing financial resourcing to, very practically speaking, to organizations that are within our network that do not have the resources to effectively participate via time buyouts for researchers associated with academic institutions and affiliates of nonprofit organizations. We provide travel stipends and reimbursements for affiliates of those types of institutions, and we actively pay for their participation what we call experiential experts, which are really, really crucial voices in the types of discussions that we're facilitating around policy recommendations, especially, but certainly also in recommendations that get directly to the practice of technology development. So that's a piece of our puzzle, and we're thinking pretty deeply about much deeper ways in which to do more of that work. There's a huge canon of literature in the field and a ton of practitioners that have a lot of experience who've been supporting that project for us, but it is an ongoing challenge, especially for technology policy, because the tech industry itself is horrifyingly homogenous. And so that is a principal challenge that needs to be addressed in any governance architecture that's trying to approach these really important questions. And the opportunities, I think, just to sort of turn to a more optimistic lens for a few moments, I think, Eileen mentioned in your remarks, you alluded to this sort of gap between the technology industry or practitioners and the capacity that government has to really meaningfully grapple with what smart regulation, law, and policy looks like. And I think in many ways, the Partnership on AI was born of an interest in meaningfully closing that gap, because there is a huge dearth of that type of expertise in government. And it's not just, I have experience personally working in the US government context, which really struggles with this challenge, but it is a challenge that governments everywhere struggle with all over the world. And in talking to people who work in multilateral institutions or in state governments, federal governments, or governments otherwise, it is always one of the first questions we get asked as an organization. What can we do essentially to more effectively understand what is happening in a field that is really challenging to understand from the outside looking in, and especially when you're starting from a place of extremely low capacity, which most governments are. So to the extent that we can, as a body of experts spanning all sorts of different disciplines and institutional perspectives, really inform some of the question asking that's happening in the public sector right now, I think that's a really, really meaningful role for organizations like the Partnership on AI and other efforts in this space to play. And so we're focused in part on doing that, and also in trying to bridge sort of sector gaps as well, because there are similar capacity challenges in understanding levels of the field, and especially the technical AI research field, between civil society and the extremely well-resourced commercial technology sector. So we're very interested in making sure that that type of capacity challenge is also addressed. And I'm going to leave it there because I could talk for much longer about all sorts of things related to PAI and its work, but I'm happy to continue the conversation later.
Thank you. And finally, Sean McDonald from Digital Public.
So my name is Sean McDonald. I work for an organization called Digital Public, which has now been said several times, so thank you for your patience. Basically, in 2012, I took a product that had a footprint in 175 countries from a desktop product into the cloud. And we were a nonprofit at the time. We were a very well-meaning organization, and we were looking for a conversation. And actually, really more than that, we were looking for guidance about how we should architect data. And we would sort of assumed that we were a lot further along in the conversation. And where we ended up getting to was finding that so much of the digital architecture that underpins our rights is actually the sort of supply chain of organizations, right? For any of you who have ever built or run an application that lives on top of AWS and then tried to make a promise to your users that you would definitely delete their data upon request, you have probably chased a rabbit hole into figuring out exactly what that means and how many layers of abstraction your agency within your contract with AWS actually goes. And so what we ended up finding is that we were operating in this ecosystem that wasn't particularly well aligned with keeping individual promises, right? And that companies as structures in and of themselves are actually also not designed to keep promises. They are structurally designed to build value and distribute or contain liability. It's what they're for. Like, it's not, you shouldn't pretend that there's something else. But that obviously means that we have this set of challenges around how easy it is to manipulate agents, right? And so there's someone named Chris Taggart who runs an organization called Open Corporates, which is, I think, the world's largest database on beneficial ownership information. He wrote a piece called Fireflies and Algorithms. And it's basically, you can spin up companies in Delaware inside of half an hour, no matter where you are in the world, right? And create that as a company that then is able to go and make promises on the internet to people about data rights. When incorporation becomes a fungible structure, when it becomes a strategic surface, right, we have a fundamental problem because most of our law is based on, most of our protections in digital spaces are based on agent-based accountability, right? So we hold companies accountable, we hold directors accountable, we may hold lawyers accountable, but where you start to see slippage in incorporation infrastructure, which is fundamentally sort of the DNA of markets, right? You start to create very real and very concerning problems about how, as Jasmine was saying, we might enforce our digital rights, right? We're making it significantly more asymmetrical and significantly more complex to try and challenge and preserve the promises that were made about how we'll be treated in various digital systems. So that was the first kind of problem that led me to data governance. And my first sort of step into that was looking at what are the legal forms, what are the enforceable structures that we use to protect common goods. And actually there's a pretty good one, and it is named deceptively simply. It's named a trust, right? We have legal infrastructure which is structurally designed to architect accountability in ways that enable us to more effectively govern common assets for shared benefit or for the public interest. And so the idea of digital trust is actually what brought me to this Digital Civil Society Lab, and it is very nice that Lucy still considers me a fellow. I'm to understand that essentially makes this the sort of fellowship California. You can come, but you can never leave.
That's how it works.
And so we started, it's a pleasure to be back. We started kind of looking at, all right, we have an interesting incorporation model. And 3-4 years ago we were doing this, we were sort of blessed by a total lack of interest from the powers that be. And what we found was that there was a huge appetite for solving this structure of problem, but that there was really, really stark disagreement on what good data governance meant. So for those of you with a background in law, there are lots of different legal theories of standing. There are lots of types of relationships you can have or wrongs that can be visited upon you or values that you can create that give you an opportunity to defend yourself in a court of law. But all of those are different theories of why we might have a seat at the table at data governance. And digitization, unfortunately, is not making that terribly simpler. For those of you who encountered Professor Arvind Naranyan's 21 Models of Fairness in Machine Learning lecture, he's now modeled 21 different approaches to equity, 21 different political philosophies that you can manifest in code. And so we have this sort of compounding of complexity in how we might design data governance systems. I'm nerdily sort of a Chance the Rapper fan, and I was listening to this song that he has just put out, and he's got this lyric that says that it's like reinventing the wheel just to fall asleep at it. And I think that that's like this sort of kind of profound observation about where we are with data governance, right? We are definitely in the space where we're reinventing something, right? We're rebuilding structures for decision-making in new surfaces. Yeah. But we haven't fixed the architectural and organizational problem, the DNA problem that replicates these kinds of injustices, this lack of inclusion, and this really stark difficulty around accountability and pursuing and enforcing our rights. And so where we are now and where Digital Public has kind of gotten to is that we're broken our work into three pieces, which I think will resonate with the different work that people are doing around the table and in the room. But it's really around trying to help build out a digital political science. We don't have a meaningful comparative taxonomy of data governance approaches at the moment. So when, say, Facebook does something, generally speaking, the public reaction is however people feel about Facebook, kind of regardless of, not totally regardless, but heavily coloring what the actual structure is. Same thing with companies or organizations that you may feel differently about. And so we are in this stage where we have lots and lots of experiments. We have lots of fodder. We have lots of pilots of people who are building new data governance mechanisms under different political philosophies, different legal philosophies with different sort of organizational and market-based outputs. But we really need to invest in these sort of common taxonomies that will enable us to separate them from political opportunism and be able to speak to it as though it's a field. And I think until we're getting to sort of that space, it becomes much, much harder to have a fair, for lack of a better term, conversation about what data governance should look like. And so our work is a combination of working with clients to help try and build and wrestle with the cultural and practical challenges involved in setting these systems up, building a very clear and direct and intentional pipeline back to researchers so that practice is leading a lot of the sort of research that happens in the space or the opportunities for research in the space. And then lastly, working with policymakers on the enabling environment, right? Because we are also in a place where the liabilities assumed for experimenting, even with the best of intentions, are all very direct and very personal. And there is a shared normative benefit, I think, in getting this right. And so finding ways that we can create graduated paths to market, graduated paths to scale and governance, and that speak to a clear understanding of why we're making decisions and who has a seat at the table in an individual circumstance, I think the closer we'll get to sort of better data governance and better AI associations generally.
Great, thank you. So here's how I'd like to structure the remaining hour, if it makes sense. You've heard a lot of examples. I tried to capture sort of what we went through just in the conversations in terms of very different domains of law or framing that we might start from to think about what kind of associational structures might work for managing digital data and AI. And we've also had at least two, I lost count, but very clear statements of sort of starting principles. One about beginning with a recognition that the systems we already have proven to be inherently discriminatory, exclusive. We've got laws that aren't enforced. So there's a lot about what we currently have in place that's not working for a whole lot of people, which is may lead then to a principle that would say start from justice, start from inclusivity, start from human dignity, which takes me to the other sort of proposition that was put out, which is that the one global framework we have that's in place that addresses both substance and procedure is the Global Human Rights Framework. It's got a lot of problems, but it's a framework that exists that might guide us. You can challenge both of those two sets of assumptions, but that's what I heard. And then a set of ways that people are actually trying to get some work done while also building the thing that they're going to do the work in. I mean, this is really a case of building the organizations while we also do the work. So what I like to do is use the next 20 minutes or so for you to ask all the questions you have of the group to make sure that other examples get out there, any questions you have get answered. Then I'd like to turn our collective attention to this idea of identifying the problem, the common thing all these efforts are working toward, things, there's lots of them, and add your thoughts, as well as hear from you about any other models, experiments, structures, strategies that you're familiar with, so that we can continue to build out our understanding of what's already underway, and then end with the focus on, well, what researchable questions can we package up nicely and leave here at Stanford and with all the other research in the room to take forward. So let me give you time to ask questions of the panel. Yes, and I'll just, 1, 2, and I don't know anybody's name, even though you've got name tags, so introduce yourself if you care to.
Hi.
Yeah, let me give you this.
Thank you very much. I'm Suzette Shipp. I work here at Stanford, and I am working as a side project on a health equity model, especially for people of color, to address both health and healthcare outcomes. It's in a very nascent stage. So I really wanted to ask Jasmine, because you said, of course, Black people, other people of color. We shouldn't have to fix everything, but of course that's what we do. That's what we've been doing since we got here. So my point is, and I'd like to know what you all think, I think we should just go ahead and formalize that because we're doing the work anyway. So I'm just trying to figure out how to formalize that, how we get credit for what we're doing, and have everybody, anytime anything has to do with us, it should go through our systems that we've created.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. So I think is really, really important, particularly in the health space. We can think of like health data as some of the most sensitive, some of the most having some of the hugest impacts or influences on life outcomes, obviously. So as far as making sure we get the credit, so we have to enforce it, right? So, but that's us too, right? And so if you're on any of the social media, I'm sure you see that people are enforcing the fact that we're not doing labor to not be compensated in some kind of way related to that labor. Whether it's credit, like you need to cite so-and-so. You need to make sure you tag them for their idea, for their intellectual property, so to speak, right? But that's still we're self-enforcing. We're community as technology. We are performing that infrastructure. I think it has to become a cultural thing where people recognize that somebody did this and their work is valuable. And you can't just build off of their work without acknowledging that there was work before. So I think that's really important. And yeah, we are doing this work. At the same time, we shouldn't have to do, and we can't do all of the work, right? So hopefully we build allies and co-conspirators actually to do this work. I think that what you're finding is a lot of people, but students and grad students and people going into the field are really interested in how to make society better. How do we change life? And so they're doing this interdisciplinary work focused on how do we remedy this stuff in various sectors. And I think that's heartening, right? Because they're doing translational work, not just the academic, but the how do we connect with the people acting on the ground? And I think that's heartening to see. And I think also seeing that universities and other organizations are now funding that kind of work and seeing the need to have this public-private or public-public-er relationships, yeah.
Any other thoughts?
So I'm Tarun Jotwani. I'm a DCF fellow at Stanford. I'm a little bit confused because today I heard that from a couple of you that there's a gap with the government. There are gaps in the government. And yesterday, D.S. Patel, the former chief data scientist officer in the government under Obama, said very explicitly that in fact the government has made many attempts to engage with the private sector, but people in the private sector don't turn up, and so therefore I'm hearing two things, so I'm a bit confused now. Anecdotally, I will say that whatever I heard in the last day and a half here in the symposium, whenever I heard from the corporate or the technology companies' reps, including Schwartz, including Schmidt, I didn't see any desire at all to actually engage. So I would, and right after, and if you bear with me, right after yesterday, I went to an AI class at Stanford, which I'm a student in, and there was a former YouTube CEO who's now doing something else, came in to talk to the class. And he talked about, and anecdotes really do bring this to life. Yeah. So I just want to, he talked about basically if the law does not disallow me to do something, why should I? So another instance of a lack of desire. So, if you can bridge that gap between, is the private sector not coming to the table, or is the government not equipped?
I'm happy to help alleviate some of your confusion. These comments won't be comprehensive, but I worked with DJ Patel in the CTO's office in the last administration, and I understand what he's describing, that dynamic. But I think that the most present dynamic is actually the lack of sustained deep expertise that exists in government. It's one thing to host a meeting and expect people from companies to show up, but it's another thing entirely for government to actually have the depth of capacity necessary and the understanding of the field necessary in order to architect multi-year long policy processes that result in smart outcomes for citizens. And so that is what I think we really see the government hasn't resolved. And the last administration tried to bridge that gap with attempts like the U.S. Digital Service and the Presidential Innovation Program, Fellowship Program, and several 18F, several other programs that really brought talent from the technology industry directly and from the research sector into government for what we essentially called tours of duty, which was a model adopted from the Defense Department, actually, in trying to get people to take sabbaticals from their day jobs and come and serve their country. And it worked out pretty successfully. I mean, there was a huge difference between what had happened in government previous to that point and where we currently are, given the programs and what they've brought essentially to the public sector. And some of that was also modeled on programs that the UK government, for instance, they were the first to architect a digital service program. And several other global governments have experimented with similar programs. So there's definitely a starting place and a foundation. I don't want to paint the picture as completely bleak, but it does remain the case that that sort of sustained deep engagement, like I mentioned, is really, really what we're missing right now. And the other thing I'll say is that, I think that to your second point, there's somewhat a hesitancy, I think, to engage with certain types of governments, depending on the political and cultural moment in which we're situated, because of a lack of trust in those institutions. And I would say we are certainly finding ourselves in one of those moments right now. I'll stop there.
Anyone else?
So I just want to underscore two big things. One is we cannot overstate the extent to which our society has been radically transformed with digitization of everything. And people are genuinely still getting their heads around it. The people you mentioned, I won't rename them, but I will say almost there's a generational passing of the baton. I think several of those people were trained in an era where if you were a technologist, you were a technologist. You didn't have to take philosophy or normative courses, humanist courses, human rights, no exposure to human rights. I see a real sea change in this idea that cross-sector policy development as well as cross-disciplinary research, I see a genuineness to the belief that that is essential to being better policy and higher quality research, and that multi-stakeholder process that's global is where the governance realm is moving. So I don't think that those people are necessarily representative of where we are today, but I will not undercut the idea that radical transformation of society and still a lot of conceptual confusion that people are trying to get their heads around. And that, there's an urgency to it, though. As everybody said, that we have to get our heads around it. But it's a hard problem.
Yeah, I think that the idea that they're not showing up is really interesting because they're the largest lobbyists in the country. And that they are 1 and 2 with a bullet. So, I think that they're not showing up the way that...
They're showing up through the back door.
I think that's the front door, friend. I don't think they're making any bones about it, right? And I think that the other thing that they've done is spin up very large internal quasi-governance structures themselves. So the fact that they're not engaging on the things that other parties want them to engage on, a lot of times I think we bring kind of education to incentive fights, right? And I think that if what we want to do is change the incentives, then we have to stop treating this as like it's a goodwill problem and start engaging in the marketplace, right? You can do a lot with insurance and strategic impact litigation. Like you can do a lot to rebalance the cost of bad behavior. And at the international stage, where there's like really interesting and potentially quite precarious moment where the international competition around market capture is driving a normative race that we as individuals, as consumers, as people who have to live in these societies should be quite concerned about. There's a great book called Rules Without Rights, which is a history of the labor and environmental regulatory spaces. And it does a very interesting job of sort of looking at this is what it means when we talk about rules that don't have implementation infrastructure, and this is what it looks like when we do, and you'll be very surprised to learn that enforcement matters. So, I think that I think the narrative that people aren't showing up is one, and in the same way that like the narrative that the law can't keep up is equally sort of absurd. Like the law can keep up at whatever pace we bring claims through it, but people are being forced into arbitration, people are being forced out of court. And so I'd just say that I think that there's a lot of participation in the mechanisms, but if we're not getting the character or the type of presentation that we want, then we have to realign the incentives about how you get there.
I'm Ren Elheim, a student in international policy here. And I wanted to stay on that moment of I've been thinking about different analogies. Eileen has brought up the international human rights law context. You just brought up liability. And in the international context, where many of the enforcement mechanisms either never existed or have been stripped of their power. So there's no tort liability. There's no intermediary liability for the things that platforms post. Are there other places that we can look to for the motivations that would bring a company, that doesn't have any legal responsibility for putting out into the world a product that is causing harm, especially in places where they haven't resourced the safety mechanisms the way that they have in our country? What are the motivations that you could look to? I mean, is there something under trade policy or product safety regulation that we can think about in especially in the deployment of AI technologies that could be dangerous in places that we don't have safety mechanisms in place?
Two quick points. I want to join the first part of your question with something Jasmine said. I mean, which I have to admit, the human rights framework has always lacked enforcement mechanisms. Okay? And if governments who have the obligation to protect liberty and security don't do it, it doesn't happen. I don't think that's a good enough reason to walk away from the framework, because I genuinely believe it's better than anything we will come up with at this geopolitical moment. But I will acknowledge the right to remedy is in there. It's just not executed upon, the failure to live up to the promise. And that's it's tough in a global system when you're depending on nation states. I want to just mention one idea that I've heard as it relates to the disinformation realm. Rather than governing through a lens of content-based restrictions, which most of the experiments in Europe have been about, NetzDG, expanding the categories of speech that are restricted in ways that violate free expression, outsourcing government function, sort of a rule of law kind of violation by outsourcing the responsibility to assess criminality, or outsourcing censorship, which is also a violation of free expression as well as the rule of law. So instead of that model, which was the first instinct of governments, pushing on two things. One is the concept of transparency as a first step of civic education, which sounds kind of boring, but at the heart of the matter, if the public does not understand how algorithmic societies work, civic space is over in a digitized society. Our autonomy and agency is going to be lost if we don't understand the basics. So I think that's much more potent than it sounds at first blush. And the second one is, as it relates to the private sector, is this idea, one of you, was it you talking about promises? Both of you, really. But consumer fraud. Not keeping promises. I think there's a lot of potential there on the advertising front and pocketing money for fraudulent advertising that's disrupting our democracy. But failure to do what you say you will do in terms of protecting data. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to work with there that doesn't get into content-based restrictions that undermine free expression.
So I just think when you have a framework, which, in theory is really good, freedom of expression, freedom of mobility, a freedom of association, all these good things in it, but you have no enforcement mechanisms, and people who are signatories can pick and choose which ones we want to, do today. It's no better than the ethics that we're talking about now. So Google, we know, had "don't be evil" for a long time, and so how are we interpreting evil? And then they jettisoned that that phrase a couple of years ago, right? So when interpretation is the issue and enforcement is the issue, then we are still in the same spot that we don't want to be in. But I think, to your point, though, where do we look for possibilities? I've been thinking about this a lot. And I've been thinking about where in both the public and private sector, what is the rate of error that is good enough? What is the allowable rate of error? If I'm doing some survey and I'm doing some experimental methods and I get over 0.05, then you know what? Something's wrong with my data. But if I deploy an algorithmic system and you know what? It's not recognizing dark women, but it's pretty good, right? Because we can find lost children. Give me a freaking break right there. So over 30%? Are we going over 0.05? Or can we lower it to what we use for medical research, to 0.001? What is the acceptable rate of error for humans? And people are dying. People are dying. Who gets to get healthcare first? People are dying. People are dying in prison. People's life expectancy is lowered. What is the acceptable rate? And is it different for different sectors of society? So, if I want to look at, strict liability law in the U.S., if I want to look at, attractive nuisance laws, if I want to look at, even FTC regulatory frameworks for deception and unfairness, what could possibly deceive somebody? What could possibly hurt somebody that they couldn't protect themselves from? We have these things in law. We just don't really enforce them with the technologies that we're allowing to emerge and be deployed upon us. So it's not necessarily that we don't have all the laws. It's that we are selective, again, with enforcing them on certain systems.
One thing that's always really struck me about this conversation particularly is that the human rights framework sort of says the words that we want a lot of data protection style law to say, but don't enforce them. And property and commercial law ecosystems don't really say the things that we want them to say, but they work way better, right? Commercial law infrastructure processes higher volumes of lower value, higher complexity cases than any other kind of legal infrastructure in the world. And that is, in many ways, the kind of problems that we're going to end up needing to solve in a lot of digital ecosystems. So I think that there's this, I always make a lot of friends by talking about commercial law, but if you hear the mechanisms that we're talking about here, product liability, we're talking about representational law, right? I mean, a whole lot would change in the economies of submitting data services if you were held legally responsible for your margin of error as a sort of slander or libel case, right? And that law exists, but there is a huge amount of sort of marrying the law that we use to regulate or manage private relationships and privately made promises with the sort of normative goods that we have always expected governments to be able to uphold. And the the pathway to market has substantially changed, right? A company can go global and launch immediately. And if you were a government before, that company had to like come to you and start a business and get permits and then seek your approval in a number of ways, and then they could get to your market. And now governments are having to figure out how they ring fence their markets and how they prevent products that are exploitative from getting there. The last thing I just want to say is one really, really simple point of intervention that I am completely confused by why we have not done more of is requiring warranties, right? You buy a car and then you use it and you drive it into the ocean. It turns out the car maker's not responsible because they told you it is only useful on the road, right? And you driving it into the ocean, despite their best intentions, was not particularly foreseeable. We have somehow in digital ecosystems stopped requiring warranties. But the thing about requiring a warranty is it forces a manufacturer, it forces a product seller to test that product in context, to make proactive assertions about what it can and should be used for, and then to channel liability through that assertion. That's an incredible way to rebalance the R&D costs and the enforcement costs that currently take place in this ecosystem. It's just one really normal commercial contracting mechanism, but it's one that we don't enforce in digital spaces and certainly could.
Great. There was a hand here. Then I ask you to remember who you're going to pass that mic to.
Hi, I'm Marta Kosmina. I work for the Campaign to Stop Kill Robots, but my question is unrelated. Eileen, I was surprised that you had Microsoft up on your list of champions under their human rights impact assessment. From what I've heard of my colleagues at the ACLU, Microsoft weakened legislation. While Brad Smith publicly talks about his concern over facial recognition, they weakened legislation at Washington State in their tech lobbying. Just recently, there was an article that came out by, I think, April Glasser, where she was talking about AnyVision, another facial recognition company that operates in Palestine and essentially has Microsoft investment and uses their services to monitor Palestinians in the West Bank, essentially a captive population that can't get away from that surveillance. And also Microsoft just won their new JEDI contract for $10 billion, which in and of itself is not nefarious, but it'll allow the Department of Defense to achieve all of its AI dreams. And seeing as Microsoft hasn't proven itself to be a super great actor in the past, and also, as we've talked about already, the laws that exist are not sufficient enough to especially in my work when it comes to fully autonomous weapons and military use of AI. A lot of the DoD policy is non-binding, it's directives, it's not legislated into law. So can you talk a little bit more about why Microsoft's on that list?
Microsoft's on that list not for the reasons you said. I'm not trying to defend any of those things. I am saying they have led in the mechanism development of human rights impact assessments. And if you compare them to other companies, they've not only embraced the responsibility under the UN guiding principles, they are actually working to apply those principles in systematic efforts of design and anticipating use of products and applications down the road. And so in a world where governments are failing and the private sector is having a much bigger effect on the enjoyment of human rights, I do appreciate companies saying, we will embrace those principles. They're not self-drafted. It's not like we got ourselves in our special group in a room and we decided the ones we like and impose them on ourselves. They're embracing this framework and they're sort of role modeling what does it look like to try to do that in their processes. So that is what I like about them.
More discussion offline.
Hi, my name is Ben Gansky. I'm a civic engagement designer and researcher at Institute for the Future. We heard a lot from you all. First of all, thank you all. This has been informative and inspiring. We heard a lot, I think, about kind of raising the floor to protect against harms. But I'm very curious, too, your outlook on what raising the ceiling might look like. Specifically, Jasmine and Sean, with your engagement with data trusts, I'm curious how can those kinds of formations or other kinds of new institutional formations make for, a greater enforcement of human rights frameworks and new opportunities for people?
Yeah, so I'm really, like I said, I'm really encouraged by movements of various communities and groups to govern themselves in various ways. Currently, right now, there's quite a few indigenous groups who have said, if you want to use our data, first of all, if you want to talk to us, right, if you want to do your research on us, but if you want to use our data, then you need to come to our house, respect our house, and follow our rules and guidelines. So we have a rule and guideline structure with regard to how you may or may not use our data, what our data is for, how you should interpret. So we have a model, right? Not just the data, we have a model that you should use when interpreting the data. And so that's encouraging, right? So you have people who have said, you know what, we're tired. And therefore, we're creating our own governance structures. With data trust, the same. With the DAX I talked about, same type of thing. So groups have recognized what we have now is not working. The tech that's being deployed on us or being used or how we're being researched, how we're being surveilled is having obviously long-term detrimental effects on us. So what can we do? And people are coming together to govern themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's that old quote that it's like, in a culture designed to make you feel insecure, being yourself is a act of political bravery. It's sort of like that with data, right? Like in an age of learned helplessness around digitization, this sort of community organizing and this self-possession and seizure of assets in terms of representing a community or a set of interests is a pretty radical act. And there's a whole bunch of examples of people doing it in these really exciting ways. We're seeing natural resource collectives come together to sort of use their data to negotiate with regulators, to negotiate with technology providers, to level the playing field, right? We're seeing large commercial actors come into the space and recognize that the things that are going to differentiate them from the big five are building better relationships and extending more equitable sort of means of adjudication. I don't know if ODR online dispute resolution is a system from eBay was kind of an early example of how you might extend governance mechanisms via technology, even though the jurisdiction doesn't require it. There's a group called the Light Collective, which is a patient advocacy group that is doing really inspiring work. The Data for Black Lives Matter movement is doing really inspiring work, both in sort of the advocacy space. Mm-hmm. And you're also seeing that there have always been these kind of informal networks of groups and often very powerful actors building value that just didn't have the means of formalization. So we're working with a group of medical researchers who also have relationships with hospitals and commercial interests and patients, and essentially building the tables they can sit all around and make decisions together in a structured way. So in terms of raising the ceiling, I think a lot of the conversation gets focused on how do we change the behavior of the big five or the big 10 or companies that everybody knows the name of. But in that focus, which is sort of like choosing to go from like tryouts to the Super Bowl, you're losing almost all of the incredible games in the middle, right? And there are these huge numbers of actors who are seizing on the kind of representation power that digitization could give them, or the constructive power that they're able to sort of take by building their own data products or their own systems. And that, I think, is, it's raising the ceiling dramatically.
I can also serve as another example. As it pertains to AI specifically, I think we're starting to see an interesting movement in the sort of activist scholar community around trying to operationalize some really, really interesting ideas that have been generated by one or several individuals trying to work out how to more effectively install values of fairness, transparency, accountability, et cetera, in AI technologies and tools. So one example from the PAI context specifically is a project that we have called About ML. It's an acronym that has too long a name for me to memorize, and I always forget it. But if you're interested, you can look at our website for more information. And the concept is essentially drawn from a body of literature that started emerging in the AI research field in the last 5 years or so around transparency and how you actually effectively produce transparency, in situ, essentially, in product development contexts. And the idea is essentially to basically a group of scholars from academia and some from industrial research laboratories started producing papers on this concept around the same period. And a lot of the idea was situated around how we can produce the essentially the equivalent of a nutrition label for data sets and models in AI, so that there's more public and institutional transparency and accountability around what the limitations of the data or the models might include, what data provenance entails for any given data set, and so on and so forth. And so we actually have modeled based on like a IETF or a W3C standards process, but we've upended it so that it includes much more community input and is a process that is not just driven by industry, it's actually driven by affected communities, essentially, through a program partnership that we've developed with a program called Diverse Voices at the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab. And the idea is to produce a standard for industry and for the research community to actually be adopted, hopefully by the end of this process, because of the involvement of these institutions from its outset. But that type of bridging this sort of academic literature into practice is also something we're starting to see much more movement in, and I think that's also a really good opportunity to incite a sort of race to the top dynamic, aside from just raising the floor, as you suggest.
Comment here, and then
My name is Alka Roy. I come from a human rights background and also in technology and art. And one of the things from a conversation yesterday that was happening, I had worked on women's rights as human rights campaign. And so I also understand the difficulty of enforcing good ideas. So I really applaud you for anchoring that. I was thinking maybe we should start a user rights as human rights so that we can start thinking about our users as humans. I also work on the...
Great idea. What a concept. But I think...
I know it sounds really... Sometimes you have to say the obvious. But I would be... so we are kind of starting a responsible innovation project, if anyone's interested. I also work on open source on trusted AI. But who pays my bills is a company. I work for a corporation and an innovation center, and this is all stuff I kind of trying to do on the side. But I wanted to list a few things that maybe we can talk about in the later part. One, and many of you have talked about it, so I just want to get inside your brains right now. But we've run into challenges of having a data governance ethical model. That I know you talked about standardization, but literally when we go out, I have 100 really smart engineers we can't figure out, not only on what data to include, but inclusive big data versus small data, inclusivity versus privacy. How did you collect the data? Whose permission did you have? What are you going to do? And do they know what you're going to do with it 5 years from now? Because once you've given it, you can't give it away. That's one thing. The other thing I'm interested in is how do you take physical rights of things or safety regulations with digital regulations, with human regulations, because that's AI, right? When you create autonomous systems, safety requirements for humans are going to now interject over safety requirements for goods, because now machines are going to take autonomous actions. So whatever your requirements may be for human activity, who is liable when somebody has an accident? Now machines are making not only decisions, not only are they product, but they're actually autonomous. So that's an interesting overlay that we're sort of looking at. It would be interesting to see what you've thought about. And the last question I would say, what we run into, and you've talked about structural funding. Universities are funded by corporations. Nonprofits are funded by corporations. If you look at motivation and influence, at the end, after studying everything, it's follow the money. And it's really hard to find and create a structure that will not only have enforcement laws, but that you can actually enforce. There's so many laws I know that people are breaking, but the ability to fight that and having the resources to fight that when other people are all kind of colluded in the back, like, let it go, let it go. How do we change that culturally? Sorry, I know it was a long. Been thinking
Well,
about
if we
it.
had the answers, we'd be in good shape. Did anyone want to respond?
I have one tiny piece, which is simply on the user rights thing. You know, it's you guys. It's very familiar to the community working on data trust, et cetera. The human rights community, it's not that familiar. And I think elevating it, like that's where the light bulb goes off, like women's rights or human rights, user rights. But I would add, the big problem here, it's not just users of products and services, it's the larger societies.
I agree, individual, collective, but I'm just saying, how do you think that?
A lot of times it's not the consumer, it's not the user, it's everybody else. And we have to think a way to talk about that.
Well, and I just want to put a note on this because I think this challenge in understanding collective rights is actually where the progress that's been made in bringing attention to digital rights largely falls flat because they're so individualistic that we've cornered ourselves from being able to. I'm looking for the associational structures of the future. It's really what's going to take action on those collective rights.
The only thing that would be is who's collective, because when people
Yes.
start defining collective, a lot of people get left behind.
Well, unless you, right, but.
I'm just
so is-
saying it's
No,
very
I completely agree, and the opportunity then is can the collective define itself, which I think is a little bit of what Jasmine is finding. And so one question for the larger group as we think about all of the ideas that are put on the board is how do those self-organized sovereign collectives, which have a set of internal facing rules, actually get recognized and have their rights enforced by the larger legal system, right? So that they're not just a bunch of one-off
Is that a two-finger?
efforts. I
have a quick
question here.
before
and
we
then
move
I think-
on.
Did you have your hand up? I'm just trying to keep track of the queues. Rebecca, are you right on this point, or? Yeah, it has to do with it. Okay, jump right in, and then we'll come back.
I think
to
there's
this
a
one.
comment.
I just had one quick response or even a bookmark actually to place in your comment about money, power, and accountability because I think it's really, really, really important. I don't think if we spent all 2 hours of the session on this topic, we would run out of things to say about that. But I do want to just note that I think one thing missing from this conversation is the role of private philanthropy in helping understand what we need to be investing in. And this has been a long conversation in the PAI context and in a lot of the civil society organizations that we work with every day. But one thing that we have noticed in working with our philanthropic partners is that there is also a deep lack of capacity in that sector to really grapple effectively with the dynamics that we see unfolding and with technology governance questions. So I think, like I said, there's a ton more to say, but I just want to recognize that as a point.
We'll skip that in. So then I had Rebecca, and then we'll go back to you, sir.
So just by way of background on collective rights, I run a project called Ranking Digital Rights, and we rank the world's largest internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on their policies and practices that affect users' human rights, particularly free expression and privacy. But the current methodology is focusing primarily on individual rights,
Yep.
but we just developed a set of draft indicators that we're going to integrate into the index, and we're going to pilot it in the coming months and do an initial pilot report that's looking at collective rights and harms. And the way we look at that is through human rights risk scenarios, we call them, that what are the potential harms to marginalized groups, minority groups, highly at-risk groups. And that's the lens we take to collective rights. So that might be useful in the discussion. The draft indicators and kind of an explanation of what rights that they're linked to in terms of what types of policies companies ought to be having in relation to AI and algorithms as well as targeted advertising are tied to specific human rights norms. And that's on our website at rankingdigitalrights.org. There's a link on the blog to the new indicators, but Also, some previous documents that go into in great depth the human rights impact scenarios, the risk scenarios that we're basing this on. So I'm happy to talk to people later about kind of where to find that stuff if you're interested.
And thank you for sharing that.
Can I ask a question
that's also
back?
what we're trying to generate, though, are those examples of other approaches.
But I do have a question. So I'm curious about how the breakdown is between sort of outcome-based rights versus procedural rights. And particularly, just thinking specifically about, like, do open-ended data licenses, for example, play a determinative role? So, for example, like, if I can't predict future harms because it's an open-ended data license,
Yeah,
does
so
that...
We're looking at things that, you know, we're biting off what we can chew in terms of what's possible to set standards for and compare and to actually draw sort of cause and effect. And so it's not all comprehensive on everything, but it's a start, right? So if that answers your question.
Terah, did you want?
No, I'm just writing. Thanks.
Ben Schneiderman, University of Maryland, and also representing the ACM's Technical Policy Committee, which works on this. I'm just very charged up and energized by all the passionate people and wonderful ideas I've heard in these 2 days, so that makes me optimistic. Of course, that optimism is tempered by the fact that so much of the negativity around here are the concerns and dangers, which is legitimate. So, I want to sort of reflect on ways to go forward, and the suggestion of a taxonomy of governance is I think, is helpful here in that what I'm hearing is a lot of devoted people from the civic action NGO kind of, independent groups here, which are moderate size at 30 or 100, people. They're okay. It's better than having every individual, every user try to fight, the battle. So that level works okay. The other level that we've got at the very top of let's get the government to do it is, a really difficult thing. Being in Washington and being on these policy things, it's really hard to move that. When you do, you have very powerful impacts, as Terah knows, and it can work out. But I'd like to advocate or raise or hear more about enlisting the existing powerful intermediate organizations. I think hinted at by Sean's comment that what about warranties? Well, right, the software industry has a history of hold harmless and delivered as is, and that idea needs to be broken. And the question is, how are you going to do that? So your partners in that, I think, are going to be the professional societies, a challenge, the insurance companies, okay, the auditing companies. I think, the KPMG, Deloitte's, and, PwCs are going to be powerful forces. And they have a much higher, stronger levers, bigger levers than the civic action groups that are smaller. They also are durable. They've been in place. They're respected, just as you wisely draw on the existing human rights guidelines. I think that's a durable, powerful structure. So I'm putting in place in this taxonomy the suggestion that the civic groups that we're hearing from could, in addition to doing their own advocacy, they could engage, enlist, catalyze, provoke, and push those other institutions which have a long history and were successful, I would say, in the recent, opioid pharmaceuticals, in bringing the smoking and tobacco industries, and in other cases where, you want to prevent or counter harm that's been put in place. So those strategies, and again, the professional societies, and the Computing Research Association, the ACM, and IEEE, the IEEE's ethically aligned design guidelines are really very nice, and we need to propagate those further. Another institution is the journalists, and propagating these ideas to reach the public. Ultimately, we need the public support to make anything happen, and the journalists need to be. And I didn't see journalists here. Maybe there were, but I didn't. I couldn't tell, or I couldn't tell there was an engagement. So I think there's a whole set of places. The enthusiasm for developing a new and focused group is great. Keep that, but add to it the leverage and power of existing institutions that are respected and have access.
If I could just
Yeah,
offer
let me
the.
just one more.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, no. If you're,
Yeah.
if you're.
I just wanted to add about, I keep hearing the word autonomous, and it's sort of a separate footnote, but I really hope that could be, put back into history as archaic as agents and, and giant brains, because autonomous is just a generic. It's either autonomous or not, or it's fully autonomous, it was said. And there's a rich, rich landscape of autonomy, of ways to design it, and the design community is what really needs to come and play. I should say I'm speaking about this tomorrow in Gates 104, but that's kind of, I think there's a way to go. But I'll just come back and say the central issue is for the political action, I think, would be to engage with these middle-sized structures.
I'm just going to offer that I've been focusing a lot in my own research on the role of supply chains recently, and that if you look at sort of the way that Walmart, quote unquote, greened its supply chain and the footprint that it had there, there have been a number of ways in which high-end or sort of top-of-market buyers are really able to, whether it's transparency through agricultural supply chains, labor monitoring through manufacturing supply chains. Those are another very important sort of existing infrastructure in which power relationships are meted out. And at the highest level, large-scale buyers' interests are very often aligned with market stability and good practice because it reduces compliance burdens. And so if you look at something like Libra, for example, the folks who were out first were the institutional financial suppliers because they had actual compliance footprints, whereas the sort of feel-good civil society actors who are meant to be the ethical backbone of that project are still toughing it out. So, just to offer that I think that there are absolutely additional infrastructures, but that there are also within the purchasing decisions that are currently made and the kind of pressures that aggregate up through reputation in supply chains, there's a huge amount of tactical surface there to do a better job of using buying power as a force for good.
How many other people have kind of a general question of this? I've got one over here. Are there others in that queue? Because I want to get to them if you're out there. And then I want us to take the last 15 minutes. If you know of a kind of associational, institutional experiment or attempt that's out there that we haven't captured up here, share it with us. And then also think about the big questions, potentially researchable questions, we can turn them into researchable questions, that you'd like to see a group of cross-disciplinary, cross-sector people take a crack at trying to understand what can we do to get better at this. I'll say this is a little bit of mini advertisement for another conference that's coming up. There's one at the end of this week, the Digital Civil Society Conference is here on campus. You're welcome to join us there. That's another scholar practitioner conversation about a lot of these issues. And then there's a Designing Data Governance Conference happening in Washington. There's lots of opportunities. We should be using these as building blocks and moving towards something rather than repeating conversations. So with that, I'm going to take this last question and then ask you to think about bigger, doable things we might undertake.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it works.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your very energizing talk and very inspiration. I have a question about your comment about warranty. And I wholeheartedly agree that the enforcement mechanism is very important, and warranty could be a good means for enforcing such standard. But however, if you look at how innovation takes place in this, especially in this digital tech companies, big tech company. If you think about the genesis of all of the companies, it's very different from their initial original visions are very different from what they look like today. If you think about Facebook, Google, even Amazon, what they initially envisioned is not the service that they're providing today. So when they say they could come up and then even at Stanford Business School, they teach that innovation. To be innovative, you just kind of pay attention to what customers do and how users use your service, and just kind of don't be rigid about your initial ideas, but to go with the flow and kind of listen to the customers and provide a service that they want. So in that context of the innovation framework, I think it's hard to envision that how you can define the warranty in the sense that this is a service that we're going to provide, and this is a boundary of the service, and like do not use the service in any other way, and I'm going to just provide a warranty only within the context. And moreover, if you look at artificial intelligence, like robots, like if we think about robots can evolve and then learn from the context, or kind of gathering information outdoor through interactions with other users. And if they start doing things that was not initially programmed to do, then who should be held accountable for the perils that results from such behaviors? And think about, and we talked a lot about the standard of the data and data governance, but if you think about how artificial intelligence or algorithms are developed, the sampling of the data, the form of the data, and how data is handled and cleaned is part of the competitiveness, and it's a very big part of the trade secret. That's why one facial recognition algorithm works better in certain circumstances and not in another. So if you enforce the things that's not quite in a way how the companies and corporations operate, and I think it's inevitable they think all these discussions are kind of irrelevant to the way they work, and they just kind of they continue not showing up and then and not participating in this kind of discussions, because that if they can think that following all this standard and guidance is either irrelevant or undermine their competitiveness or innovation. So I just wanted to hear your thought on that.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. I think that the sort of like easy way to start is to say that if you look at like Helen Nissenbaum's work on contextual integrity, right? The way that most things work sort of through the entire course of human history is about how we contextually understand each other and the representations that we make to each other in an environment or in a proposition. You know, I often compare tech company design to foie gras farming. So, you know, when you first get a goose, everybody wants it to grow, right? And the foie gras farmer especially. And what happens is when the company gets to a certain size of maturity, the goose's incentives and the foie gras farmer's incentives diverge pretty strongly, right? They cut that up. They cut the goose up usually into pieces. So I think that that's probably like a thing to know at the beginning, right? Because what ends up happening, the types of pivots that you're describing in analog commercial terms are like deceptive commercial practice, right? And so that there is a whole bunch of things that are original parts of the agreement that we undertake with companies that I don't think we want to give totally unilateral license to companies to change. And I think we've got a good series of reasons why we don't do that. There are, if you look actually if you think about technology as sort of something that amplifies our power over each other, most of the way that, say, ethical certification, ethical kind of guidance and pathways to market have been designed are about starting with like a little bit of value proposition and then allowing a sort of higher risk experiment to then validate that. And you get, so like mice trials, and then you go to human trials, and then you go to FDA approvals. And I mean, hopefully he's got FDA approvals in the beginning. But the point being that we have lots and lots of ways that we manage dynamic pathways to market, and that they don't have to involve deception. And I think that, or that they don't have to involve really, really materially different changes. And I think that we should, when services change their terms like that, we should treat them as new services. Like what WhatsApp's data policies changing have put now hundreds of millions of people in the position of having the fundamental promises made to them when they signed up to the platform completely violated with no recourse. So I'm sure that whatever experience Facebook will deliver via WhatsApp will be magically worth the hundreds of millions of people's expectations being violated. But I don't know what that looks like yet. And I don't think that for them, the sort of equities are in place. So I hear what you're saying. I kind of find the innovation at all costs narrative to be really, I take your point about it being the state of play, and so something that we have to engage in if we want, to an extent, a certain amount of participation. But I think that, I was really sort of serious about standing up for one's rights as a radical act in a space where we're told again and again that we have no ability to hold anybody accountable. As someone trained in international law, I just think we can do a lot better, and I think we can work with both bigger carrots and bigger stakes.
Do you want to follow up?
You might also, other people I'm sure have better thoughts here.
So I'm not saying that innovation should take place at all costs. I agree with you, but I just I'm just lost in the sense that I don't find adequate legal framework or standard that can be applicable in this kind of situation, because I think it's like our negligence standard is reasonableness. So, I think it's, right, yeah. So then if you cannot, it's really hard to prove that you can reasonably expect the use of this and that and in that context. And at the same time, in international law, context of international law too, is that there are cases where I find analogy in the case of use of child labor. So child labor is such a it's something that we would like to avoid at all costs, and then some people boycott products made with child laborers, and but there are a lot of trends in economy that I don't see that very effective enforcement mechanism that can be applicable in all those situations. So I'm just trying to understand what is the right standard and framework that can be applied in this very fluid and not a binary kind of situation.
I think you find yourself in very good company in this room of people who are also looking for standards that will increase enforcement. So I don't know that anyone's got a perfect answer. I'm more than happy to dig in on negligence law and but maybe just recognizing we're on the clock. We can do that after. That's right?
There's a lawyer checking the clock.
Every 6 minutes.
That's right. Big ka-ching, ka-ching. Let's just shift the direction for the last few minutes here. From all of this, are there folks in the room here sort of sitting with, what we need to know? We need to know X. What is the big question that you're left with, or smaller questions that we might add up? Where are you sort of feeling like there's some positive movement? Help us figure out from this conversation, from all of those ideas, different domains of laws, different associational structures, what else do we need? What do we need next? What do we need to know? What do we need to think about?
I thought from this discussion what was missing is things that bring the result of this biased data and biased infrastructure alive, and in terms of examples of I'm struggling with this thing of having sort of almost perfect data when we are flawed and biased human beings. So the data is going to be flawed, and perhaps we keep the danger, of course, is we stop this great innovation and great movement by actually creating speed breakers. One radical thought is let it keep going and provide the rules after we figure out how a lot of these biases are working.
There are people being hurt in the immediate term. I think the challenge here, and I'm not sure that this particular session is where the question about data in particular fits in, but to be honest, sir, I think there's a very strong sense that what you think of as fabulous innovation is seen by an extraordinary number of people who are often not heard as nothing but harm. And stopping it would be a step forward. So I think we're looking for middle ground there, but I encourage you to consider leaving behind the narrative that innovation at speed, innovation is an inherently good thing with some, maybe some, external costs, when the world is telling us, and there was a whole session, several sessions yesterday, those are lived experiences and real people, and they're not externalities. So I think part of the challenge here is realizing that they're two very different narratives, and one should not be treated as secondary to the other. They're both of primary concern. So let me take this question and then here.
One thing I would like to have a multidisciplinary team tackle is how to inform people, users, policymakers, otherwise, what are the limitations of the systems without EULAs?
Without what?
End user license agreements, because those are just like full of legalese. No one reads those, and no one is going to get informed about those things.
So even just a better conversation between the product and the user.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Can you just slide that down?
Hi. So I have sort of two things. One is kind of related to what this gentleman just said, which is, I think one way to think about, maybe it's a way to expand on what you just said, which is, how do we think about the difference between availability of information and access to information when it comes to things like transparency, when it comes to things like end user agreements, right? So we all click agree, but we almost certainly don't understand what we've agreed to. So can we create processes that make it so that you actually have to try to ensure that people actually understand it rather than that they just click a box? And not just on end user agreements, but like when you're releasing data, when you're doing transparency reports, are those available to people in a way that you don't have to be an expert to understand? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. And like, do people know they're available and where to find them and how to find them and are they publicized? So I think there's this question about availability versus accessibility. And I think that's worth sort of digging into. And then another thing that I'm sort of left with at the end of this is about measurement. And we have this a little bit on bias in particular. I mean, like Joy's presentation, there's some people doing good work. But how do we measure the harms and the value? Because we're talking here about trade-offs. And I think it's hard to know what the trade-offs are when we don't know how to measure what the impacts are. And I suspect, and we have some measurement of the harm a little bit, but not as much as we need. I think we have relatively little like concrete measurement of the value, like what's the actual added value, and then how do we consider these trade-offs, and when the trade-offs are between lives and a game or whatever. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but how do we create measurements that allow us to have those conversations in more concrete ways?
Thank you for your comments. One of the things we're struggling with in an open forum is just definition. A common definition of what transparency means, what harm means, because what may appear harm to you is cost of doing business for someone else. And I'm not being flippant, but literally we're sitting down and you have all these really smart people trying to agree on basic principles, but what do they really mean? Definition. The other thing that I think we have an opportunity in this group is so many white paper. I'm like white papered out. There's so many intelligent people thinking about these things intelligently, but we need a platform, which is what I was hoping we would get here, of a really strong collective, many collective, common collective voice that says, you're causing confusion through academics, through business parlay, through even human rights language in some cases. Can we cut the crap a little bit or cut through the crap? And it's not all crap. There's really smart discussions going on. Can we synthesize it in a way? Because guess what? We are building things while people are debating things. No one is stopping the AI stuff we're building because waiting for this to figure out. And once we build things and they're in the system, it becomes punitive to stop it. But if you get ahead of the curve, which we were talking about in the design process, in the concept, you're partnering with the innovation. And so that's really, like, fundamentally, the way we pose the question is, how have the tools and information so that ethical people can make the right decision. Because we don't even have that.
Thank you. I mean, I guess in the conversation about associations and associational forms, would just call back to your point about funding. I don't know that that was fully addressed, both in terms of for specific associations or organizations like the Partnership on AI, for example, that are being developed right now to like do some of this work, like who is funding that and what are the impacts of that, and like should folks be paying attention to that? And if so, how and why? And then to the question about the point about the nonprofit model as the management of private financial resources for the public good, just like that arguably emerged at a specific political and economic moment as like as a mechanism for hoarding wealth and concentrating power. And so with the application of that to data as an associational form and as an institutional form, would just want to like flesh out that history a little more and flesh out how that actually functions and what the like how that could look different in the context of data. Yeah.
Can we make things more fun? Because like I want to work on responsible AI, but I kind of want to have fun with it too. So if there's ways that academics or people are thinking about adding more art, and it was lovely, the poetry, and bringing that flavor of what a different voice feels like from a place of strength, so that it's like, oh, we're not depressed now and everyone's popping something after all, like, But if there's a way to do that, I think it would just literally, that's the humanity,
I think Stephanie talked, because I was at the AI assembly that she had this year. And so,
okay.
Yeah, so Stephanie and people are doing that work. So, yeah.
But more integrating, into...
Absolutely.
More of it.
Let's have fun.
I wrote it down.
Are you not entertained?
Any of you have sort of final thoughts or comments you want to share?
A dance routine, the fun part.
Oh, it's so too bad that we're out of time now. The dance routine we did talk about it ahead of time. I just want to plug really quickly that November 8th in Washington, D.C., we're hosting something called the Data Governance Design Conference, which is very much an intersectional event bringing together mostly data governance practitioners, but also academics, policymakers, funders, and lawyers. Sorry about that last one. But we'll have engineers there too, just in case that helps. But essentially all aimed at really practice-led question about articulating a practice-led research agenda for data governance. So how do we de-risk and enable more experimentation, more ethical use and infrastructure? And Lucy and Jasmine will be joining us there. So the Data Governance Design Conference, which you can find at https://governingdata.org. It is, yeah. Yeah, no, it's where all the fun is.
That actually feels like the point on which I should stop. Thank you.